Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio Channel. Tonight we slip into the damp twilight of 17th century Virginia, where river mist hangs low over the tobacco fields and a few lines of legal writing are about to alter countless lives. You may think great historical changes arrive with trumpet blasts, marching boots, or kings shouting from balconies. But sometimes they arrive by candlelight, in cramped rooms, with scratchy pens, tired lawmakers, and language so dry it almost hides the human pain inside it. Tonight, you step into that quieter kind of turning point. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and as you listen, comment below with your location and your local time. Now, dim the lights, and you find yourself standing at the edge of Virginia in 1662, where the air smells of wet earth, wood smoke, and curing tobacco, and where power is learning how to make itself permanent. You move slowly along a dirt path pressed flat by carts, boots, and bare feet. The ground is soft under your soles, it clings to you. Virginia is still a young colony by European standards, but it is old enough to have developed habits, fears, and ambitions of its own. Houses of timber and brick sit apart from one another, separated by stretches of worked land, kitchen gardens, sheds, and pens. The rivers do much of the talking here. They carry boats, rumours, laws, and profit. The first thing you notice is the smell. Tobacco sweetens the air in a rough, heavy way, mixed with animal musk, chimney soot, and the sourness of damp clothes never fully dry. Everything seems touched by labour. Hands have chopped these trees, raised these fences, planted these fields, and hauled these barrels. Nothing here feels accidental. Even the silence has effort in it. You're in a place where survival still feels close enough to touch. A bad harvest matters, a fever matters, a broken cartwheel matters. But so does status, and perhaps more than ever. Some men own land. Some hope to. Some own labour. Some are labour. That is the cruel arithmetic humming beneath the quiet landscape. You pass a tobacco field where workers bend in rows, their bodies moving with practised rhythm. Leaves brush against sleeves with a papery whisper. Gnats drift in the humid light. The sun has not fully risen to its hottest height, but the day is already sticky, shoulders glisten, backs ache. Nobody needs to explain this work to you. The body understands it immediately. Among these workers are people from different backgrounds, though the colony is working harder each year to pretend those differences mean everything. English indentured servants labour beside African men and women, though not always under identical terms, and certainly not with identical futures. That uncertainty is part of the story. In earlier decades, the status of Africans in Virginia had not always been defined with total precision. Some gained freedom, some held land, some went to court. The lines were harsh, but not yet fully locked into the rigid shape later generations would recognise. That grey area, inconvenient and human, is beginning to disappear. You feel it in the way people speak. Not loudly, not dramatically, in hints, in assumptions, in glances too long to be accidental. Planters talk of order, inheritance, discipline, and property. They do not present themselves as villains. History rarely offers the courtesy of obvious costumes. Instead, they sound practical, worried, even respectable. That is what makes them dangerous. A man can do extraordinary harm while sounding like he's merely arranging accounts before supper. By the 1660s, the tobacco economy is hungry. It eats land and labour with equal appetite. Wealth in Virginia depends on workers who can be controlled, counted, and ideally replaced without too much moral inconvenience. Indentured servitude had long supplied much of the colony's workforce. English servants arrived bound for a term of years, often under miserable conditions, in exchange for passage, food, and the distant hope of freedom dues. It was a brutal system in its own right, yet it had an ending built into it, at least in theory. A servant might survive the term. A servant might become free. That possibility, however fragile, made some planters restless. You can almost hear the worry behind closed doors. What happens when labourers become free and demand land? What happens when former servants compete, complain, or join unrest in a colony where elites crave stability? Temporary labour begins to look less attractive than perpetual bondage. Cold thought, effective thought, terrible thought. And so Virginia leans harder towards slavery. Not all at once, not with a single magical switch. History is more slippery than that. But custom, profit, and law start locking together like damp boards swelling into place. The colony begins to shape a system that can reproduce itself, a system that turns human beings into inherited property. That phrase lands like a stone, even in a sleepy voice. Inherited property. There it is, the nightmare hidden inside clerical neatness. You continue walking, and the settlement widens around you. Chickens scratch near doorsteps. A dog barks once, then loses interest. Somewhere, metal strikes metal in a smith's yard. The sound rings clean through the thicker noises of the day. A woman stirs a pot over a fire. The scent of cornmeal and salt meat drifts outward, warm and plain. Life goes on with strange stubbornness, even inside cruel systems. People laugh, they gossip, they pray, they fall in love, they grieve, they keep going because dawn keeps arriving whether justice does or not. For Black Americans, though the term itself belongs to a later age, the reality forming here is already distinct and brutal. Many people of African descent in Virginia have been taken through Atlantic networks of violence that link local fields to distant ports, traders, and empires. Some come from West Central Africa, others from different regions, carrying languages, skills, memories, and beliefs unfamiliar to the English colonists. Planters often pretend these lives begin upon arrival. They do not. They begin elsewhere, in homes and kinship systems that the records of the colony barely bother to imagine. You pause near a storehouse where barrels are rolled toward transport. The wood creaks. Rope fibres scrape against palms. You can feel the rough grain of a post beneath your fingers as you stand in shade for a moment. Shade is precious here. So is water. So is privacy. People learn quickly who is permitted comfort and who is denied it. One mainstream fact presses through every scene around you. Tobacco has made Virginia powerful enough to become more confident in its cruelty. The crop requires exhausting labour, careful timing, and endless handling. That demand drives much of the colony's legal and social change. It is not the only cause, but it is the background drumbeat. Behind legal debates and moral excuses, there is leaf, soil, sweat, and export. Still, colonial life is never as tidy as its lawmakers pretend. A quirky little detail drifts through local records and observations from the era. Colonists often believed tobacco itself could cleanse bad air or ward off disease, and some smoked with almost comic seriousness. As if a cloud of fragrant leaf might bully illness into retreat, you can picture it. Can you not men discussing mortality while confidently inhaling the crop that already rules their days? Human beings do love a bad remedy wrapped in certainty, yet beneath the everyday bustle is a growing anxiety about lineage. Who belongs to whom? Who inherits what? Who can claim a child? Who can claim labour? In England, the common law tradition often treated a child's legal status as following the father. That principle mattered in questions of legitimacy, name, and inheritance. In Virginia, however, the colonial elite confront a world they themselves have distorted. Enslaved black women are vulnerable to sexual exploitation by white men, including powerful men. Children are born into this violent imbalance. If the father's status determined the child's condition, many cases would become awkward for men who preferred appetite without consequence. So the colony begins to move toward a different rule, not because it is humane, quite the opposite. It is profitable. If the child's condition follows the mother, then the children of enslaved women will also be enslaved. The system feeds itself. No need for constant fresh justification. No need to wrestle with paternal obligation. The mother's bondage becomes the child's fate at birth. You can feel the ugliness of that logic even before it is formally written. It lurks in everyday assumptions, in how women are watched, in how pregnancy is counted, in how infants are seen not as miracles but as future labour. The body of the enslaved woman becomes doubly exploited. She is expected to work, and her children can be claimed as property. The law has not merely noticed life. It has entered the cradle with a ledger. Historians still argue over the exact blend of motives that shaped these early statutes. Was the 1662 law mainly a response to disputes involving mixed ancestry children? Was it chiefly about maximising labour supply? Was it an attempt to settle contradictions between English legal traditions and colonial practice? The answer is likely some combination, which is both intellectually honest and emotionally unsatisfying. Human cruelty often has several clerks working at once. As you drift farther into the settlement, you notice how authority performs itself. Men gather in discussion wearing the look of people who assume the world can be arranged through signatures. Their clothes, though far from luxurious by later standards, still show distinction in fabric, cut, and cleanliness. Boots are better mended, hands are less torn. They speak of governance, church attendance, debts, acreage, punishments, and household management. Their concerns sound administrative. That is part of the chill. Violence becomes easier to sustain when it disguises itself as procedure. In the quarters and workspaces of the labouring poor, procedure feels different. It feels like intrusion, a whip hanging in view, a demand barked at sunrise, a magistrate's ruling none of the vulnerable were meant to influence, a child taken into account only as value. Here the law is not abstract. It is a hand at the throat, even when it appears on paper instead of skin. You stop by a small doorway where evening air has finally started to cool. Smoke rises in a thin ribbon into the darkening sky. Crickets begin their patient music. The colony softens in sound, but not in substance. Someone hums quietly inside. The tune is low and steady. It does not ask permission to exist. That matters. So much in this world is built to deny personhood, and yet personhood refuses to vanish. Memory survives in song, gesture, cooking, naming, prayer, and stubborn affection. Even where power tries to flatten human lives into assets, people remain gloriously inconvenient. That, perhaps, is what the lawmakers fear as much as anything, not only disorder, but human complexity. A system of permanent slavery requires simplification. It needs categories fixed, futures assigned, tenderness discounted. It needs to look at a mother and see an economic principle. It needs to look at a child and see an extension of ownership. It needs everyone else to accept this as normal, or at least inevitable. You stand still and let the night settle around you. The air smells cooler now, with marsh water, smoke, and trampled grass. Mosquitoes drift near your sleeves. Somewhere out on the river, oars dip softly. The stars appear one by one, indifferent and ancient. Virginia in 1662 is small in the scale of the universe, but the choice being shaped here will cast a long shadow. That shadow is not mystical. It is bureaucratic. It is written by people with names, desks, interests, and excuses, which is somehow even more haunting. And you, walking gently through this dim colony, understand the awful calm of it. No thunder splits the sky. No choir announces the danger. A legal culture is tightening. A labour system is hardening. A racial order is becoming hereditary. The change does not need to shout. It only needs to be recorded, repeated, and enforced, So the fields breathe in darkness, the houses settle, the river keeps moving, and inside the colony's quiet machinery, a new certainty is taking shape. One that will tell black mothers their children are not fully their own, and tell powerful men that exploitation can be inherited as neatly as land. Morning opens slowly over the plantation country, and you wake into a world already at work. Mist slides above the ground in thin white bands. The air is cooled for a little while, though not for long. A rooster makes a ragged attempt at authority. Somewhere nearby, a bucket scrapes against a well curb, and the rope groans with each pull. You stand in the pale light and take in Virginia's tobacco land, where wealth grows from fields that never look rich at first glance. They look wet, stubborn, and exhausting. Mud sticks to your shoes, smoke hangs low from cooking fires. The sweet and bitter scent of curing leaf drifts over everything like a second weather. This countryside is not arranged for beauty, though it sometimes pretends otherwise. Riverbanks glitter in the early sun, trees lean over the water in elegant silence, birds flash through the branches, yet every pleasing detail sits inside a harder truth. The colony is being built as a machine for extraction. Soil is forced, bodies are forced, time itself is forced into a schedule of planting, hoeing, cutting, hanging, packing, and shipping. Even the river seems employed. You begin walking toward the fields, where the day is already taking shape in rows. Tobacco plants stand broad and green, their leaves thick as folded cloth. Touch one and it feels almost waxy. Brush past a row and the leaves leave a damp trace against your sleeve. There is something strange about the crop. It looks lush. It smells almost inviting. It is also a tyrant. Planters measure their hopes in hogsheads and pounds. But the crop extracts its payment in aching backs, stained fingers, and years burned away under the sun. Labour is everywhere you look. Men lift tools. Women carry water, kindling, and bundles. Children move in smaller tasks that are still real work. The sounds build gradually. Hoes chop into soil with dull rhythm. Carts rattle over roots. A horse snorts and stamps. Voices carry, but not freely. Orders travel farther than laughter. The whole place runs on supervision. You notice how much of plantation life depends on sorting people into ranks. The sorting is not casual. It is becoming one of the colony's favourite arts. At the top stand the larger planters, men who hold land, command labour, and speak in the tone of those who believe hardship becomes respectable once somebody else performs it for you. Beneath them are overseers, hired hands with fragments of authority, often eager to prove they possess it. Then come small farmers, tenants, servants, and enslaved workers, all living in varying degrees of dependency. The distinctions can be slippery in daily conversation, but they sharpen quickly when food, punishment, or freedom is at stake. This social order does not arrive polished. It feels improvised, patched, and anxious. Virginia is still a place of rough edges. Houses may be cramped and smoky even when the owner has status. Roads are often tracks more than roads. Illness moves quickly. Teeth fail early. Linen mildews. Pork turns if salted carelessly. Yet roughness does not prevent hierarchy. In some ways, it intensifies it. When life feels uncertain, the powerful cling even more fiercely to visible difference. You pass the main house of a middling planter, and it tells its own story without saying a word. The building is sturdier than the workers' quarters. The windows are cleaner. The doorway is swept. Inside, the smell is different. Less smoke, more stored grain, wax, and wood. A brass object catches the light. A chair has a back high enough to imply importance. Such things are small comforts, almost laughably small by grand European standards, and yet here they function like theatre. They announce who may sit, who may command, who may eat first, and who may be made to wait. Out in the yard, the theatre ends, A woman bends over a wash kettle, her hands red from work. Nearby, an enslaved man shoulders a barrel with another labourer, and both men move with the practised caution of those who know a dropped load becomes somebody else's excuse to punish. A child watches from near a fence, silent and alert. Every face around you seems trained in reading mood. That may be one of the most valuable skills in Virginia. Not writing, not rhetoric. Mood. The weather of power changes quickly. A mainstream fact anchors everything here. Tobacco dominates the colony's economy so completely that it influences land use, trade, politics, and social rank. A planter with successful fields can gain credit, connections, and local influence. A poor yield can drag him toward debt. Because tobacco drains the soil, growers constantly seek fresh land, which pushes settlement outward and deepens conflict with indigenous peoples. The crop is not merely an agricultural choice. It is a hunger that reshapes society. And what a demanding crop it is. It must be planted carefully, weeded constantly, topped at the right stage, cut at the proper moment, then dried and packed with stubborn attention. The work is repetitive, intimate, and relentless. This is not wheat scattered in broad gestures. Tobacco asks to be handled leaf by leaf. Planters like the prophets, workers inherit the misery. You stop near a curing shed and let your eyes adjust to the dim interior. The smell here is thick enough to taste. Sweet, dusty, bitter, almost leathery. Hanging leaves rustle softly overhead. Light cuts through cracks in the boards in narrow golden lines. It is quiet inside, but not peaceful. The shed feels like a chamber where labour has turned into inventory. Outside, people sweat to raise the crop. Inside, the crop waits to become money. Money, though, is a slippery word in this colony. Actual coins are often scarce. Tobacco itself can function like currency. Debts may be reckoned in pounds of leaf. Fees, wages, fines, and taxes can be paid in the crop. Imagine that. A society so thoroughly under tobacco's spell that its favourite plant becomes part wallet, part whip. It is practical. Yes, it is also faintly absurd. Human beings love inventing systems that sound sensible until you step back and realise everyone is essentially arguing over fragrant leaves. This strange economy sharpens status in very material ways. A man with many acres and many labourers can produce more tobacco, and more tobacco means more leverage. He can buy imported goods, acquire additional land, marry advantageously, and secure a reputation as substantial. Reputation matters here almost as much as acreage. People talk, they count your barrels, they notice how many workers move at your command. They measure your rise and your decline with cool interest. For black people in this world, status is not simply low, it is being systematically recast as inheritable degradation. In daily plantation life, that shift appears in 100 little moments. Who eats where, who may leave without permission, who is searched, who is struck, who is named in inventories, who is spoken of as if they possess inner life, and who is discussed as labouring capacity with a pulse attached. The colony is inventing habits of perception that make injustice feel ordinary. You see this most clearly in the spaces where bodies rest, because rest itself is a privilege distributed by rank. The quarters for the enslaved and for many servants are cramped, smoky, and poorly insulated. Bedding may be rough straw or coarse material that holds dampness. Clothing chafes. Shoes are often inadequate or absent. In winter, cold enters through every gap. In summer, heat lingers after sunset, thick and breathless. Sleep comes to tired people, but not necessarily to comfortable ones. Listen carefully and the plantation reveals its layers. From the main house may come the clink of pottery, a low murmur of conversation, the brief scrape of a chair on floorboards. From the workyards come sharper sounds. Tools knock together, Animals shifting in their pens, a cough that will not settle, the splash of slops tossed into dirt. From the quarters come hushed voices, a baby fussing, someone singing under the breath, a bit of laughter that appears and disappears quickly. These sounds are social facts. They tell you who is sheltered, who is exposed, and who has to hide ordinary human feeling. Even smell marks rank. Near the planter's dwelling you notice beeswax, stored apples, ale, and clean linen on a good day. Near the labourer's spaces it is sweat, ash, damp earth, and clothing that cannot be fully washed of toil. None of this means comfort for the wealthy was luxurious in any modern sense. It means only that inequality can thrive splendidly even among people who would all complain about the mosquitoes. A quirky tidbit from plantation culture slips into view when you pass a garden plot near the house. Colonists often prize not only useful herbs but ornamental flowers and imported plants as signs of cultivation. In a place still rough with mud and timber, a carefully tended patch of rosemary or gillyflowers could announce refinement with almost comical seriousness. Imagine ruling over a brutal labour regime and then pausing to admire your scented borders as proof of moral taste. The human capacity for self-flattery is truly one of history's most durable crops, yet the fields remain the centre of gravity. Under the rising heat, workers move more slowly, then force themselves onward, sweat runs down backs and into collars, hands sting from friction. The sun presses on shoulders as if trying to flatten everyone into the same exhausted posture. But the colony refuses sameness. It insists on ranking that exhaustion. The planter may complain of pressure, debt, risk, and weather. The worker experiences those things through hunger, force, and punishment. One man's worry is another person's captivity. You notice, too, how law and status mingle in conversation. A planter speaks as though authority naturally belongs to property holders. A magistrate uses language that sounds neutral, but neutral for whom? Even churchmen, who might be expected to disturb this order, often settle into its vocabulary with surprising ease. They speak of obedience, household governance, and Christian duty, sometimes with genuine concern, sometimes with convenient vagueness. Moral language softens many sharp edges without removing any of them. Scholars continue to debate exactly how quickly racial distinctions hardened on the ground compared with what statutes declared. Daily life was messy, records are uneven, people crossed lines in work, intimacy, religion, and local custom, even as the elite tried to police those lines more fiercely. Some historians see a gradual tightening driven by labour demand and class fear. Others emphasise moments when officials made deliberate choices that accelerated racial slavery. Both views capture something real. Plantation society was neither fully accidental nor perfectly planned. It was a cruel structure assembled through repeated decisions. At midday, the light becomes merciless. The fields shimmer. Air barely moves. You taste salt on your upper lip. A worker straightens for a moment and presses a hand into the small of the back. Another keeps going without pause. There is no romance left in the landscape now. Only function. The crop must be managed. The bodies must keep pace. Time is measured in output. And yet, within this punishing order, people still create hidden forms of meaning. Someone braids hair with care. Someone saves a seed. Someone remembers a song pattern carried across an ocean. Someone shares food quietly. Someone teaches a child a word the masters do not know. These acts do not cancel exploitation. They do something else. They declare that a person is more than the rank assigned to them. By late afternoon the light softens a little, and the plantation begins its transition from labour to the labour that follows labour. Fires must be lit, water must be drawn again, tools must be put away, animals must be checked, food must be prepared. There is no neat division between work and life here, because work has swallowed life whole and still asks for seconds. You stand at the edge of a field and look across rows of tobacco trembling in the evening breeze. The leaves whisper against one another. The sound is almost delicate. That is the unsettling thing about this place. Its surfaces can seem calm. The river glows. Birds settle into trees. Supper smoke rises in blue ribbons. Yet beneath those quiet images lies a social order growing more severe with each season, one that is learning how to connect land, law, race, labour, and inheritance into a single durable design. Virginia's wealth does not simply emerge from the soil. It is organised out of hierarchy. It depends on making some lives count as ownership and others as output. The fields teach this lesson without ever speaking. Every row says the same thing in green silence. Status here is not decorative. It is the skeleton of the colony, and the deeper it sets, the harder it becomes for the powerful to imagine any world not built upon bent backs in the tobacco sun. You enter Virginia at a moment when the rules are still unsettled enough to confuse almost everyone. That uncertainty does not make the colony kind. It only makes it unstable, improvised, and strangely revealing. In this world, people are already being exploited with enthusiasm, yet not every category has hardened into the iron shape it will later take. The door is not open in any generous sense. It is simply not fully shut. That faint gap changes how people move, bargain, fear, and hope. The morning begins with river fog hanging over the James like breath held too long. Water taps softly against a rough landing where a small boat knocks against its post. You smell mud, fish, wet rope, and wood smoke from hearths waking inland. A gull cries overhead with the kind of confidence only gulls possess, as if it personally owns every shoreline nearby. A labourer lifts a sack from a skiff, shoulders straining, while another steadies the load with both hands. Work starts early because Virginia has learned that daylight is money, and human stamina is apparently a resource to be squandered. Yet as you look around, the colony refuses simple categories. An English servant may be under contract for years, owned in effect, but not forever, at least in theory. An African labourer may be treated as permanently unfree in practice, though the laws and local customs still show awkward seams. A few people of African descent have managed to gain freedom, acquire land, raise livestock, or bring cases into court. These are not signs of equality. They are signs that the legal regime is still being assembled and has not yet erased every opening. You walk past a modest homestead with a patch of peas, a hen scratching near the doorway, and a lean dog sprawled in the dust. The house smells of smoke, damp boards, and stewing beans. A child peeks around the doorframe and vanishes again. On the far side of the yard, a man chops wood in a steady rhythm, the axe biting cleanly into the block. His shirt sticks to his back. His shoes are worn to softness. He could be a servant nearing the end of a term, or a poor freeman trying not to sink, or someone whose status others prefer not to state too clearly. That ambiguity is part of the texture of the place. The colony has plenty of unfree labour, but the forms differ. English indentured servants usually arrive by agreement, though consent is a slippery word when hunger and desperation stand behind the signature. Some have sold years of their lives for passage. Some have been pressured into terms they barely understood. Some were children when bound out. These servants can be beaten, overworked, and punished for running away. A master may add time to a contract for disobedience or pregnancy. Life for them is harsh and often deadly. The system is cruel even before racial slavery fully settles in. African labourers face something even more perilous because their treatment is increasingly detached from any fixed term. Some may still move through a colony where precedent is uneven, and not all officials agree on every detail. Yet many are already experiencing conditions that amount to slavery in all but formal completion. The uncertainty cuts in only one reliable direction. It rarely protects the weak. It gives power room to experiment. A mainstream historical fact rests at the centre of this uneasy period. In early Virginia, labour systems included both indentured servitude and expanding lifetime bondage, and the legal distinctions between them could be inconsistent in the first half of the 17th century. Records show Africans who became free, owned property, or testified in legal matters, even while other Africans were held for life. This mixed evidence does not point to fairness. It points to transition. The colony is deciding what sort of brutality it prefers. You continue toward a county court day, one of those occasions when the colony gathers its paperwork and pretends disorder can be cured by enough ink. Men arrive by horse, boat, and foot. Boots carry in clay. Hats come off. The room smells of wool, sweat, paper, and candle grease. Voices hum low at first, then sharpen as cases are called. Debt disputes, property claims, labour complaints, moral charges, petty insults inflated into principle. It is all wonderfully human and terribly consequential. Here, status can be argued aloud. A servant petitions for release from unfair extension. A master insists the servant is idle, insolent, or sickly through personal fault, which is a bit rich given the diet and workload. A free man of African descent appears in the record as a landholder or witness, and the mere fact startles later readers because it complicates the cleaner racial hierarchy people expect to find. You can almost feel future generations squirming at the messiness. History is very rude that way. It refuses to become a neat diagram on command. One case hovers in the background of this period with particular force, that of Anthony Johnson, an African man who achieved freedom and held land on Virginia's eastern shore. He was not typical, but he was real. His life shows that the early colony contained unstable possibilities before the law narrowed them further. The existence of such figures reminds you that rigid racial slavery was built, not simply discovered. It had to be codified, defended, and repeated. Still, possibility should never be mistaken for safety. A free black family lived under pressure from a society where white officials and neighbours could reinterpret rules, challenge claims, or lean on courts when convenient. A small piece of land did not cancel the surrounding atmosphere. Freedom in such a place could feel conditional, watched, and one bad judgment away from collapse. You step outside the courthouse for air. The day has warmed. Flies circle near a horse trough. Someone has dropped apple peelings in the dirt. A man drinks from a jug and wipes his mouth with the back of his hand. Another complains about labour shortages and rising expectations among servants, which is one of those phrases that sounds ordinary until you translate it properly and realise he means he hates when exploited people expect to be treated as human beings. Colonial plain speech can be remarkably efficient at hiding ugliness behind routine annoyance. The social mixing of the labouring population also troubles the elite. Poor English servants and African labourers sometimes work in close proximity, share quarters or tasks, trade information, flirt, quarrel, and occasionally join in resistance. Their conditions are not identical, but their daily worlds overlap enough to alarm those who depend on hierarchy. Planters prefer clean divisions. Reality keeps smudging the edges. This helps explain why the colony becomes so eager to sort people not only by condition but by ancestry. A society built on labour extraction fears solidarity among the exploited. If poor Europeans and Africans see common cause, even briefly, the ruling class has a problem. Distinguishing them more sharply becomes politically useful. Race, in this sense, grows not only from prejudice and profit, but from fear of shared grievance. It is a management tool with devastating human consequences. A quirky detail from the wider Atlantic world drifts through the scene. 17th century Virginians sometimes relied on marks, symbols, or oral acknowledgement in transactions because literacy was uneven. Not everyone signing away labour, witnessing debts, or defending rights could read the words shaping their fate. Imagine the courtroom solemnity of legal procedure resting on parchment many participants could not decipher. There is something darkly comic in the colony's faith in documents, considering how many people involved were expected to trust sounds they could not verify. You wander farther inland and find a patch of woodland where the noise of work falls back for a moment. Pine resin warms in the sun and scents the air. The bark under your hand feels rough and dry, a relief after the swampy softness near the river. Insects pulse in the undergrowth. For a few breaths the colony seems almost quiet. Then an axe sounds from somewhere distant, followed by another, and the spell breaks. Virginia is always clearing, cutting, extending itself. At the edge of one field, an African woman straightens and rolls her shoulders, then bends again to the task. Nearby, an English servant mutters under his breath about rations. Another man glances toward the overseer before taking a longer drink from the water bucket than he ought. None of these people are equally vulnerable. Their futures are diverging, even when their tools are the same. The servant may dream in calendar years. The woman may know the calendar offers her no promise at all. That difference matters more each season. And yet, in this in-between time, some habits from English law still jostle against colonial improvisation. Questions arise about baptism, paternity, term length, punishment, and the status of children born in the colony. Local authorities do not always resolve them consistently. They borrow old traditions when useful and discard them when profit demands it. Flexibility sounds pleasant until you realize it belongs mostly to those already in charge. Scholars still disagree about how to describe this transitional phase without flattening it. Some warn against overstating fluidity, because many Africans were enduring bondage long before statutes fully clarified matters. Others argue that the surviving evidence reveals real, if limited, spaces where status remained negotiable. Both cautions matter. Too much emphasis on openness risks minimizing suffering. Too much emphasis on inevitability hides the choices made by lawmakers and planters. The truth sits in the tension. Early Virginia was already violent, yet not yet as legally sealed as it intended to become. As afternoon lengthens, you stop near a communal work area where food is being prepared. A pot bubbles over coals. Cornmeal thickens under a wooden spoon. Smoke catches in your throat. The meal is plain, filling, and repetitive. Someone tears at a heel of bread with weary fingers. Hunger makes most food persuasive. Nearby, a woman uses a shell to scrape and clean, quick and efficient. A child nods off sitting upright, then startles awake. Even in a colony obsessed with status, everyone must eventually deal with supper, ash, and tired feet. You notice that names travel unevenly here. Powerful men are named in deeds, patents, and offices with satisfying regularity. Labourers appear more inconsistently, sometimes only when punished, taxed, sold, or disputed. Black women in particular can vanish into records that notice them most clearly when their labour or fertility affects somebody else's property. It is one of history's nastiest tricks. The people who endured the most are often described the least. You learn to listen for them in fragments, in court mentions, inventories, christenings, and silences. There are also the subtle ways people hold on to selfhood. A gesture of grooming done with care, a story repeated at night, seeds selected from a remembered plant, rhythms hummed too softly for masters to notice. These do not transform the system, but they resist its favourite lie, which is that domination can fully define a person. The colony can force labour. It cannot perfectly erase memory, preference, humour, or attachment, not for lack of trying. Evening spreads gold across the water when you return toward the landing. Frogs begin their low, ridiculous chorus in the reeds. The air cools by a degree or two and feels almost merciful. Boats shift against the bank. A lantern is lit, then another. Across the river, smoke rises from a distant homestead in a straight blue line. It would be easy, from far enough away, to mistake this place for a simple frontier community full of ordinary struggles. But close up, the unsettled rules tell a darker story. The colony is deciding who can hope, who can petition, who can inherit, and who can be inherited. That is the trouble with half-formed systems of oppression. They reveal the process. You can see the joints, the debates, the convenience, the moments when another path might have existed for at least a few people. The blurred lines do not mean justice was near. They mean the machinery was still being adjusted. Some doors still opened a crack. Some claims could still be made. Some people stood in court as more than property. And that very instability made the elite impatient. So the twilight settles over Virginia with all its mixed signals intact. A servant counts years, a planter counts output, a free black landholder counts risks. An enslaved labourer counts nothing because counting implies control, and control belongs elsewhere. The colony keeps moving through fog, heat, paperwork, and appetite, not yet fully fixed but leaning, unmistakably, toward a colder design. In the hush of evening, you can feel that lean as clearly as the river current against the shore. You step into a room where the future is being narrowed by a sentence, not a sword stroke, not a trumpet call, just a rule written in measured language, the kind of language that likes to pretend it has clean hands. The chamber is plain, close, and warm from too many bodies sharing stale air. Candles soften the corners, papers lie stacked on a table scarred by years of use. Quills scratch. A chair creaks. Someone clears his throat with great self-importance, as if the noise alone improves governance. Outside, the colony smells of mud, horse sweat, and river damp. Inside, it smells of ink, wool, and the dangerous confidence of men who believe they can sort human life into tidy categories. You are in Virginia in 1662, where lawmakers decide that a child's condition will follow the mother. The words are brief, their consequences are endless. Under English common practice, many legal questions had long leaned on paternal status. In this colony, that approach proves inconvenient to powerful men. Convenience, sadly, has launched many legal innovations. If a white father could pass on freedom or responsibility to a child born to an enslaved black woman, then planters and officials would be forced to confront their own behaviour in uncomfortable ways. Better, from their point of view, to shift the rule. Better to let bondage descend through the mother. Better to protect property, profit, and male impunity all at once. A mainstream historical fact sits at the centre of the room. The 1662 Virginia law declared that children born in the colony would inherit the condition of the mother. This principle made slavery hereditary through the maternal line and gave legal support to a system that could reproduce itself. Few statutes have done so much violence with so little ceremony. You feel the ugliness of it because the rule is so calm. Nothing in the wording needs to shout. The lawmakers do not write. We intend to strengthen exploitation and reward sexual coercion. They do not need to. The colony understands its own logic. A child born to an enslaved woman will be enslaved. A child born to a free woman will be free. The mother becomes the hinge on which an entire structure turns. Her body is no longer seen merely as labouring power in the present. It is treated as a source of future property. That shift changes the meaning of birth itself. In a more merciful world, birth would bring kinship, hope, and fragile wonder. Here, for black women under bondage, birth is forced into an accounting system. An infant can be seen as a future asset before taking steady steps. The cradle becomes entangled with the ledger. It is hard to imagine a colder theft than this, a law that reaches into motherhood and rearranges it for someone else's gain. You leave the chamber and walk into the afternoon heat, because the law does not stay indoors. It spills outward into yards, kitchens, fields, sleeping spaces, and whispered fears. The sun presses hard on the settlement. Cicadas buzz in the trees like rattling instruments wound too tight. Dust clings to your ankles where the road dries. From a nearby shed comes the smell of tobacco leaf. sharp and sweet. From a cook fire comes onion, broth, and wood smoke. Life continues with insulting normality while the colony quietly redefines family. A woman lifts a bucket from a well, pauses to adjust her grip, and carries it toward a yard where children move around her legs. One child laughs, another stares. Their small voices float in the hot air, and that sound alone makes the law more unbearable. The statute is not simply about abstract status. It is about these children, these mothers, these households. It tells the colony that black motherhood can be used as a transmission belt for slavery. It tells powerful men that whatever part they play in conception, the burden will fall elsewhere. The rule also answers a practical problem that planters prefer not to phrase too plainly. Children of mixed ancestry are increasingly present in the colony. Their existence reflects sexual contact across lines of power, including coercion, assault, and exploitation, that the records rarely describe with the honesty they deserve. If paternal identity mattered most, some white men could face obligations they do not want. If maternal status governs, the colony spares them that inconvenience. It is a neat solution for the powerful and a devastating one for the vulnerable. There is bitter irony here. English tradition often valued paternal descent in inheritance questions. Virginia departs from that pattern not to challenge patriarchy, but to reinforce slavery. The colony bends legal custom when profit asks nicely. That is one of the enduring lessons of this moment. Systems that call themselves principled can become extremely flexible when cruelty becomes profitable. A quirky detail from the legal culture of the time adds another layer of strangeness. Many colonial statutes were drafted with bracing brevity, as though human consequences grew lighter when squeezed into fewer words. You can picture a clerk trimming phrases, sharpening the line, making the text efficient, never once pausing to admit that he is helping to script generations of suffering. Bureaucracy has always loved compact sentences. They fit so nicely on the page. You continue through the settlement and notice how the law changes the social atmosphere even for those who never read it. News does not move only by official proclamation. It moves by repetition, by assumption, by casual talk near doorways and at table. A planter explains the new certainty to a neighbour. An overseer absorbs what it means for inventory and discipline. A minister hears it discussed with legal confidence and gradually folds it into his moral vocabulary. An enslaved woman may learn its meaning not from the statute itself, but from the way people begin speaking about children in her presence. That change in speech matters. Language teaches a society what to notice. Once status is said to follow the mother, every pregnancy and bondage gains a grim legal clarity. There is less ambiguity to contest, less room for a father's acknowledgement to matter, less chance for a child to escape the category imposed at birth. The colony has not invented oppression from nothing, but it has made one of its mechanisms far more reliable. You stand near a fence in the late light and feel the wood rough against your hand. Splinters rise beneath your fingertips. Beyond the fence, two women sort vegetables in shallow baskets. Their movements are efficient, almost quiet. The smell of crushed greens mixes with damp earth. A baby fusses, then settles against a shoulder. This ordinary tenderness is exactly what the law cannot understand. It sees only transmission of status. It does not see humming, soothing, feeding, watching, worrying, or love. Law often congratulates itself on clarity by discarding whatever is most human. For black women, the burden becomes doubled in a way the colony finds useful and ordinary. They are expected to labour in fields, yards, kitchens, dairies, and households. At the same time, their reproductive lives become entangled with property. The law deepens surveillance of their bodies. Pregnancy is not merely noticed. It becomes economically meaningful to enslavers. That reality gives sexual exploitation even broader protection, because the resulting children enlarge the enslaved population, and therefore the wealth of those who claim ownership. The room around you feels closer when you think this through. Heat lingers beneath clothing. Sweat cools, then sticks again. Somewhere nearby, a horse stamps at flies, a baby coughs, a pot lid rattles as steam lifts it. All these small sounds continue while the colony absorbs a principle that will shape birth, inheritance, labour, and race in one motion. The quietness of the moment is almost unbearable. Scholars still debate exactly which disputes or pressures most directly prompted the statute. Some point to cases involving mixed ancestry children and questions of legal accountability. Others stress economic calculation, especially the growing desire to secure enslaved labour through natural increase rather than relying solely on purchase and transport. Some emphasise the colony's broader effort to align race and status more tightly in law. The evidence suggests these motives work together. Greed rarely travels alone. It prefers company. The law also helps the colony settle a contradiction it had created for itself. White male authority depends on patriarchy, yet the realities of slavery threaten to complicate paternal responsibility. Rather than asking fathers to answer for children born through unequal and often coercive relationships, the colony relocates legal consequence to the mother. This is not a side effect. It is a feature. Men with power are spared legal discomfort. Women without power absorb the damage, even for people not directly touched by such births. The rule signals something larger. Virginia is choosing heredity as the future of slavery. Bondage will not remain only a matter of capture, purchase, or uncertain local custom. It will be renewed through the womb. That's a dreadful sentence to write. But history insists on it. A society that once still showed legal irregularities now moves closer to a closed circuit, one designed to produce its own labour force generation after generation. You walk toward the river as evening lowers itself over the colony. Water reflects streaks of fading gold and grey. Oars dip in slow rhythm from a passing boat. The marsh smells green and a little sour. Frogs begin calling from the reeds, patient and repetitive. Such soft sounds make the human decisions feel even harsher. Nature continues without commentary. The colony, meanwhile, has chosen commentary of the most ruthless kind, turning ancestry into policy and motherhood into legal machinery. On a landing nearby, men talk in practical tones about acreage, prices, and shipments. One laughs. Another spits into the water. Their ease is revealing. The law has given them certainty, and certainty is a comfort the powerful rarely hesitate to enjoy. They can now imagine future labour not only arriving by ship, but being born on land they control. Their wealth becomes more secure because the colony has agreed that the children of enslaved women belong to slavery from their first breath. There is something especially haunting about how this principle outlives the men who wrote it. They sit with their papers and their polished little assumptions, never fully seeing the length of the shadow they cast. Yet the statute will echo through households not yet built, and through generations not yet imagined. It will shape naming, separation, sale, and survival. It will help turn racial slavery from a harsh practice into a self-renewing system. A child runs barefoot along the edge of the yard, then stops to examine a feather with complete seriousness. The gesture is so small and so alive that it almost breaks your heart. The colony sees future value. You see curiosity, warmth, breath, and a whole unwritten life. That contrast is the deepest wound of all. Law can classify, it cannot comprehend a person. Night gathers slowly, cooking fires brighten. The scent of cornmeal and smoked meat drifts on the cooler air. Crickets take over from the cicadas. In some doorway a woman hums low, almost too softly to hear. The tune rises and falls with the gentleness of rocking. Around her, the settlement continues to arrange itself into ranks and rules. Inside the song there is something else, something no statute can fully master. Yet the law remains, brief, deliberate, and devastating. It tells the colony exactly how to interpret the next birth, and the next, and the next. It tells enslavers that lineage can be monetized. It tells black mothers that the colony claims the right to define their children before those children can speak. It tells everyone watching that slavery in Virginia is becoming not merely a condition imposed on individuals, but a hereditary design. And in the candlelit stillness of 1662, that design takes hold with terrifying grace, smooth on the page, brutal in the world, changing forever what it means to be born black in English America. You follow the law from the page into the hands that enforce it, and the first thing you notice is how ordinary those hands look. They are ink-stained, ringed, calloused, or neatly washed depending on the man. They lift cups, sort papers, count tobacco, gesture across tables, and point toward fields. Nothing about them announces that they are helping build a system of hereditary slavery. That is part of the chill. Great cruelty often arrives dressed as routine administration. It clears its throat, smooths its cuffs, and asks for better record-keeping. The day begins in a county office where shutters are propped open against the heat. Sunlight falls in narrow bars across a table crowded with petitions, account books, folded notices, and a sand shaker for drying ink. The room smells of paper, damp wood, tallow, and the faint sourness of wool worn too long in a humid climate. A clerk bends over a page, lips moving as he copies a line. Outside, wagon wheels grind in the dirt. A horse flicks its tail against flies. Someone laughs in the yard, brief and careless. Inside, a legal order is learning to sound calm while it rearranges human lives. You watch magistrates and local officials speak in that familiar colonial tone of practical concern. They discuss discipline, inheritance, contracts, births, punishments, debts, and household order. Each word sounds modest by itself. Together they form a cage. These men do not see themselves as the inventors of misery. They see themselves as managers of a difficult society. That self-image matters, because it allows them to convert appetite into principle. Once a desire for labour becomes a matter of governance, exploitation puts on a clean collar and pretends it belongs in respectable company. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. In 17th century Virginia, slavery did not harden through one law alone. It developed through a growing body of statutes, court rulings, and local practices that increasingly tied African descent to permanent bondage. The 1662 rule was one decisive step, but its force depended on lawmakers, magistrates, and planters who kept translating policy into daily enforcement. The plantation elite understand something simple and terrible. Custom can be challenged, habit can blur, but law, once repeated, can train a whole society to treat violence as procedure. So they write, they revise, they clarify, they answer disputes with statutes that always seem to settle in favour of ownership. A person runs away, the response concerns service and punishment. A child is born, the response concerns condition. A conversion occurs. The response concerns whether baptism alters bondage at every turn. The colony learns how to close a question without loosening control. You leave the office and move toward a planter's house where several men have gathered over a long table. The room is cooler than outside, though not truly cool. The walls hold in the smell of pipe smoke, spilled ale, and drying leather. A jug sweats near a stack of wooden cups. Flies linger around a rind of cheese. One man taps a finger against the table as acreage is discussed. Another mentions labour shortages with a frown that suggests nature itself has offended him by failing to provide enough captive workers on demand. They speak of people as burdens, investments, and liabilities, sliding easily between household language and market logic. It is the colony's favourite trick. Turn domination into bookkeeping, and suddenly it sounds like prudence. These conversations do not stay private for long. They flow outward into county decisions, parish expectations, neighbourly imitation, and family ambition. A smaller planter hears how a grander man manages labour and copies the method. A magistrate grows accustomed to ruling in ways that protect property first. A minister learns which moral emphases keep the peace among the powerful. Little by little, a legal culture settles into place. Not everyone loves every detail. Not everyone thinks in exactly the same terms. But enough people accept the direction for it to become the new common sense. This is how systems become durable. Not because every participant fully understands them, but because enough participants find them useful. You cross a yard where geese complain beside a trough. The late morning sun warms the packed earth under your feet. A woman beats a rug against a rail, and dust rises in a pale cloud that smells of wool, soot, and stale rushes. Nearby, 2 enslaved men lift casks under the eye of an overseer, whose authority rests mostly on posture, impatience, and the possibility of violence. His hat is better than theirs. His temper is worse. He is exactly the sort of middling figure any unjust order requires. Too dependent to be generous, too empowered to be harmless. Law reaches the plantation through people like him. He may never draft a statute, yet he gives it muscle. A magistrate declares conditions. An overseer interprets them through command. A planter justifies them through profit. Between these roles, legal abstraction turns into daily pressure on bodies. A quirky detail from colonial record-keeping slips into view when you glance at a household inventory being reviewed indoors. Such inventories could list livestock, tools, bedding, kitchenware, and enslaved people in the same practical sequence, as though a feather bed and a human being belong to the same moral category. The flatness of the form is astonishing. 1 line for pots, 1 line for cattle, 1 line for persons reduced to property. Bureaucracy can make horror look dreadfully tidy. The more you listen, the clearer the colony's reasoning becomes. Law is not merely describing slavery, it is refining it. A planter wants certainty over children's status. The law provides it. Officials want fewer disputes over who owes what labour. The law provides language. Masters want religion to stop complicating ownership. The law begins separating Christian identity from freedom, step by step. The colony identifies every crack where mercy, confusion, or inherited English custom might weaken permanent bondage, then fills that crack with another ruling. You notice how much this depends on performance. In public settings, men of authority adopt the tone of reluctant necessity. They speak as though disorder forced their hand. They worry aloud about stability, morality, and social peace. Rarely do they say the most obvious thing. They want a labour force they can control across generations. They want sexual exploitation without paternal obligation. They want wealth secured by law. There. It sounds hideous when phrased plainly, which is why plain phrasing is avoided. By noon the air's thickened. Heat presses down on the roofs. Tar softens. Flies grow bolder. You move into the shade of a passageway and rest a hand against the timber frame. Warm from the sun on one side, and cool where the interior holds back the day. From the kitchen comes the smell of onions, vinegar, and boiling meat. From somewhere in the yard comes a baby's cry, sharp and tired. In the distance, axes rise and fall with dull consistency. Life continues under the law's expanding shadow, but now the shadow has sharper edges. You begin to see how language helps people live with what they are doing. Officials speak of order, planters speak of management, churchmen speak of obedience. None of these words is false in the narrowest sense. That is what makes them effective. They are half-truths used to hide whole injustices. Order for whom? Management of what? Obedience under whose power? Once these questions are not asked, cruelty becomes conversational. There is also a political dimension to all this, though the politics are local, muddy, and deeply personal. Virginia's ruling men compete with one another for land, labour, influence, and reputation. No planter wishes to seem weak in discipline if his neighbours are hardening theirs. No magistrate wants to appear unreliable in defence of property. Law becomes a way to signal seriousness. Harshness passes for competence. The colony confuses ruthlessness with maturity, which is a very old mistake and never a charming one. Scholars still argue over how much credit to give elite planning versus messy local improvisation in the making of racial slavery. Some emphasize deliberate policy from above, pointing to the clear pattern of statutes that increasingly fix status by race and birth. Others stress the accumulation of ad hoc responses to lawsuits, labour disputes, demographic change, and planters' immediate needs. The distinction matters, but perhaps not as comfortingly as one might hope. Whether carefully designed or opportunistically assembled, the results still work to devastating effect. In the afternoon, you accompany a local official on visits related to taxation and household oversight. He rides with the stiff patience of a man who enjoys being deferred to. The horse smells of sweat and hay. Saddle leather creaks with each step. At one property, he asks after acreage and stored crop. At another, he notes labourers with the detached interest of someone balancing figures in his head. You see how governance enters private spaces not as grand philosophy, but as a series of inspections, assumptions, and written notations. A household becomes a unit, a child becomes a category, a woman becomes the source of inherited condition. Once recorded, these reductions begin to feel official, and what feels official is often mistaken for what is natural. But nothing about this is natural. It is chosen, repeated, and defended. Near dusk, you reach a churchyard where the evening air finally loosens the heat. Grass brushes your ankles, cool and slightly wet. The smell is green, mixed with old timber and the mineral scent of disturbed soil. A bell sounds once, then again, not loud but carrying. Parish life might seem like a possible counterweight to harsh law, yet the church in Virginia is tangled with the same hierarchy as everything else. Clergymen depend on local elites. Moral teaching bends towards social stability. Compassion survives in individuals, perhaps, but institutions often prefer peace with power over friction with injustice. A magistrate emerging from the church door greets a planter with easy familiarity. They talk about roads, attendance, and the need for discipline among the labouring population. The words drift across the yard on the cooling air. It is all very civilised sounding. That is precisely the problem. When exploitation is discussed in polished tones beside a church wall, the colony begins to believe its own manners. You walk on and hear music from a distant quarter, soft percussion made by hands on wood, then a low voice carrying a line too brief to catch. The sound is fragile, but it travels. It reminds you that law never entirely controls inner life. People still make rhythm, prayer, memory, humour, and affection in the cracks of domination. Yet those cracks are being narrowed. That is the achievement of the lawmakers. They cannot erase humanity, so they try to regulate the terms under which humanity may survive. One more feature of this legal culture becomes visible at nightfall. Enforcement does not always require constant spectacle. Once rules are known, much of their power lies in anticipation. A mother understands what the law says about her child. An overseer understands what the planter expects. A clerk understands how certain disputes should be resolved. The colony trains people to predict coercion, and prediction does much of coercion's work. Fear becomes efficient. The lamps are lit now. Tallow burns with a faint greasy smell. Moths flutter dangerously close to the flame, which feels a little too symbolic to ignore. Around a supper table, men speak with satisfaction about clarity in the law. They like categories that hold still. They like rules that favour owners. They like a world in which their private desires can be sheltered beneath public language. They will call this good governance. You, standing in the dim room with smoke in your clothes and evening damp on your sleeves, know it for what it is. It is power written in ink and then sent walking through the colony in boots. By the time the stars appear, the machinery is humming with greater confidence. Planters have legal backing. Magistrates have forms. Clerks have precedents. Overseers have authority. Each man can tell himself he is only doing his part. That may be the most dangerous sentence in history. Only doing my part, only following custom, only maintaining order, only recording what the law requires. Piece by piece, responsibility dissolves into procedure, while the suffering remains sharply personal for those made to bear it. And so the colony settles into night. Not quiet exactly, rhythm, but organised. Frogs called from the marsh. A door thuds shut. Somewhere a child is soothed to sleep. Somewhere else a ledger is closed for the day. In that contrast lies the whole moral failure of Virginia's ruling order. Human lives continue in warmth, breath, and tenderness, while power keeps translating them into entries, conditions, and inherited claims. The ink dries, the law stays, and the people who wrote it can finally rest, comforted by the false elegance of a system they have helped make permanent. You enter the world of black women in Virginia not through a doorway, but through a burden. It is everywhere at once, in the field, in the yard, in the kitchen, at the hearth, beside the cradle, under the eyes of masters, under the judgments of law, under the heavy weather of the colony itself. The load is physical, legal, and intimate. It sits on the shoulders and in the muscles, but it also presses inward, into privacy, fear, and hope. To understand what this colony is becoming, you have to stand where black women stand, because the system is learning to draw profit from every hour of their labour and from every child they may bear. Morning comes humid and grey. The air feels thick before sunrise, as if the day has already been handled by too many hands. Smoke from the first fires slides low across the ground. It smells of green wood, damp straw, and yesterday's ash. Somewhere a baby whimpers, then quiets. Somewhere else. Feet move across packed earth, fast and practised, because chores begin before light properly arrives. You follow the sound of water sloshing in pails and the soft scrape of a broom over a threshold. The colony wakes in tasks, and black women are already inside several of them. One woman carries kindling in both arms, the sticks rough against her skin. Another bends over a pot, stirring meal as steam wets her face. Another lifts linen from a basin, wrings it with strong wrists, and hangs it in the thin dawn breeze. A younger girl, minding a child, shifts the child from one hip to the other and bounces gently without pausing her work. These motions are ordinary. They are also relentless. No bell rings to separate household work from field work, or care work from punishment, or pain from necessity. Everything folds together. A mainstream historical fact gives this harsh rhythm its shape. In 17th century Virginia, black women were exploited both as labourers and as bearers of children, whose legal status could now be claimed through the mother. Their work mattered in the present, and their reproductive lives were increasingly treated as valuable to enslavers, because the law made bondage hereditary. The colony had found a way to profit twice. That fact changes everything around you. It changes the meaning of pregnancy. It changes the meaning of childhood. It changes how a woman is watched when her body shifts, when her belly grows, when a child is born, when that child survives. Nothing is allowed to remain fully private. The colony has reached into the most intimate part of life and attached an economic meaning to it. You walk toward the quarters in the pale light and notice how close the spaces are, yet how little privacy they allow. Walls are thin. Doors do not seal well. Voices travel. A cough carries through the boards. A murmur at night may be heard by someone who should not hear it. Bedding is rough, sometimes shared, often damp in bad weather. Clothing scratches at the neck and wrists. Even rest has a public quality, because power can enter at any hour. That matters especially for women. They are expected to labour hard and to remain available to the demands of others. They may cook, wash, haul, weed, plant, harvest, mend, nurse, soothe, and endure, often within the same day. Then comes the unspoken terror running under many of these tasks. A powerful white man's interest may become another danger to survive. The records of the colony rarely describe that danger honestly. They use soft words or no words at all, but the structure speaks plainly. A law that lets the child's status follow the mother protects exploitation from becoming liability. You do not need a dramatic scene to feel this. You feel it in the atmosphere, in the caution with which women move around certain men, in the silence that follows particular footsteps, in the way a glance is lowered not from respect, but from calculation. Safety here is not a stable condition. It is a shifting guess made moment by moment. The day brightens, and with it the work expands. In a kitchen yard you smell onions, wet ash, and animal grease. A pot lid chatters as broth begins to boil. Chickens peck at the dirt near a doorstep. A woman kneels to scrape a vessel clean with sand and water, her fingers red from repeated use. Nearby, another woman balances a toddler on one hip while reaching for a bucket with the other hand. The child presses a hot cheek against her shoulder and begins to doze. Even this small softness must compete with urgency. The water still has to be carried. What the colony calls household labour is not gentle. It scorches, strains, cuts, and wears the body down. Laundry means lifting, scrubbing, wringing, and hauling. Cooking means fire, heavy pots, smoke in the eyes, and no guarantee that one may eat well from the meal prepared. Childcare means vigilance while exhausted. Yard work means repetitive motion under weather that is rarely forgiving. Then there is field labour when required, because the colony does not believe in limiting exploitation to a single setting. You move out toward a patch of cultivated ground where women work among tobacco and food crops. The soil is dark and moist near the roots. Insects hum in the heat. Sweat gathers under sleeves and at the back of the neck. The leaves brush against arms with a sticky softness that soon becomes irritating. A woman straightens for just a breath, pressing a hand into her lower back, then bends again. Another wipes her forehead with the inside of her wrist and keeps moving. The work asks the body to forget itself. A quirky detail from colonial daily life appears in the small practical knowledge women carry. Many understood herbs, roots, and household remedies in ways the formal records barely valued. They knew what might calm a stomach, ease a fever, scent a room, soothe a child, or flavour a meagre meal into something bearable. These skills rarely counted as authority in the official world, though households quietly depended on them. History is funny that way. The people treated as least important are often the ones keeping everyone alive, yet knowledge did not guarantee protection. A skilled woman could still be punished. A mother could still be separated from a child. A cook could still go hungry. A healer could still be claimed as property. Utility gave enslavers reasons to keep someone alive, not reasons to respect her personhood. That is one of the darkest mechanics of the system. It feeds on competence without granting dignity. You pause in the shade of a tree where the bark feels cool against your palm. For a moment the wind lifts, and the air smells of pine, crushed grass, and distant river water. The relief is brief. Beyond the tree line, somebody calls an order. A child cries with the sharp outrage of being made to wait. A woman's voice answers, calm but tired. The colony is full of women performing calm while carrying more than calm should ever be asked to bear. Consider what motherhood means here. In any hard world, mothers worry over hunger, sickness, weather, and survival. In Virginia's slave society, black mothers face an added horror. Their children can be claimed by the system from birth. A child is not only vulnerable because the world is harsh. The child is vulnerable because the law already imagines ownership. That changes the emotional weather of ordinary care. Feeding a child, holding a child, singing a child to sleep, all of it exists under the knowledge that affection does not secure possession. The songs matter. You hear one at midday, low and repetitive, almost more hum than melody, as a woman rocks an infant under the narrow shade of an outbuilding. The tune rises and settles, rises and settles. It is not performance. It is regulation of breath, comfort shaped into sound. The baby relaxes slowly, nearby. A kettle lid rattles and a fly worries at the rim of a bowl. The world remains rude and practical, yet this little pocket of tenderness opens inside anyway. Scholars still debate how directly enslavers in early Virginia calculated the value of enslaved women's childbearing at this stage, or how fully that logic was systematized in the 1660s compared with later periods. The records do not always expose intention cleanly, but the legal framework had already made the incentive unmistakable. Whether every planter expressed it openly or not, the colony had created conditions in which black women's fertility could be turned into inherited wealth. The uncertainty is about emphasis and timing, not about the moral direction of the system. You pass by the house of a planter family in the later afternoon, and the contrast is painful in its banality. Inside, the air is scented with wax, bread crust, and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Outside, a black woman beats dust from a cloth in the yard while keeping half an eye on a pale child at play. Not her own child, but one who must also be watched. The labour of care itself has been divided by rank. Some women are permitted to mother within a household's respectability. Others must nurture the children of those who claim power over them, while their own children remain vulnerable to neglect, hunger, or seizure by the demands of work. There is a cruelty in this arrangement that words barely hold. Imagine soothing one child while worrying over another. Imagine being needed everywhere and protected nowhere. By evening, bodies begin to show the cost, hands swell, feet ache, smoke has settled into hair and fabric, shoulders burn from lifting, the back complains in quiet pulses. A woman carrying water pauses longer now before taking the final steps. Another sits for 1 minute on an overturned bucket, elbows on knees, staring at the ground, not in leisure but in recovery. Nearby, a little girl plays with a scrap of cord and a smooth stone, inventing a whole world out of almost nothing. Even play has resilience in it. You notice, too, the social intelligence women must develop to survive. They read moods, avoid conflicts when possible, create alliances, exchange warnings, share scraps, and memorize who can be trusted with which truth. They know which door creaks, which child wakes easily, which mistress notices missing flour, which man should never be met alone if it can be avoided. This is expertise born of danger. No school will praise it. The colony will not record it as achievement, yet it is one of the most demanding forms of knowledge in the settlement. As night comes on, supper smells drift through the quarters and yards. Cornmeal, greens, salted meat if fortune has not entirely fled. Smoke curls upward and disappears into the deepening blue. Crickets begin their steady music. A woman rubs oil into cracked hands. Another braids a girl's hair by firelight, fingers moving gently through tangles despite her own fatigue. A baby sleeps at last, mouth open, breath sweet with milk. These scenes are small, but they are not minor. They show what the law cannot control, even as it tries to own the lives around it. The colony has made black women carry a double burden, and sometimes a triple one. They labour as workers, they endure as women under racialized domination, they mother under a legal system eager to claim the fruit of motherhood. Yet within that burden lives astonishing endurance. Not the sentimental sort that excuses cruelty, but the real kind that keeps memory, care, and personhood alive under pressure. You stand in the warm dark and listen to the sounds settle, a spoon against a bowl, a hush to quiet a child, a whispered exchange too soft to catch, a night insect striking the wall, then falling away, around you. Virginia's social order continues to harden itself through law and habit, but here, in the lived experience of black women, you understand its deepest design. It wants labour from the hands, obedience from the body, and future property from the womb. That is the full reach of its ambition, and still, against that ambition, a woman leans close to her child and hums. She smells of smoke, sweat, and crushed herbs. Her hands are worn, her eyes are tired, her care remains precise. In a colony determined to convert life into value, she continues doing something value can never fully measure. She protects what she can, she teaches what she can, she loves where she can. That quiet persistence is not softness, it is strength under siege. You move now into the colony's sacred spaces, where people speak of sin, grace, duty, and salvation while standing inside a system that has grown strangely comfortable with bondage. The church bell rings across the damp Virginia morning with a sound both clear and weary, drifting over fields, lanes, and river mist. It calls people toward worship, toward order, toward a vision of the soul that claims to matter more than earthly rank. That sounds promising for about half a second. Then you remember where you are, in this place. Even religion is asked to behave itself. The meeting house stands, plain and practical, built more for use than beauty. Its timber walls hold the smell of old wood, damp wool, candle smoke, and the faint sour trace of many bodies gathering in close air. You step inside and hear benches scrape the floor. Boots thud softly. Someone coughs into a sleeve. A child whispers and is hushed. Light enters through small windows in pale slants, catching dust that drifts with dreamy calm, as if the room itself has no idea what moral evasions it is about to host. A mainstream historical fact shapes everything here. In colonial Virginia, baptism did not come to guarantee freedom for enslaved people. Over time, lawmakers and planters moved to make clear that Christian conversion would not alter a person's legal status in bondage. That decision mattered deeply because it stripped one possible religious argument for liberty of much of its force. You can feel the tension even before anyone says it plainly. Christianity teaches that souls stand equal before God, at least in theory, and that baptism marks entry into a spiritual community. Those ideas could be unsettling in a society built on inherited domination. If an enslaved African accepted baptism, became a Christian, learned prayers, and entered parish life, what then? Could such a person still be held as property by another Christian? Could a master command a fellow believer with whip in hand? Could a church speak of brotherhood on Sunday and sail on Monday? Awkward questions, really. Bad for smooth administration. Bad for property. Bad, above all, for the peace of men who preferred piety without consequences. So the colony learns to separate spiritual status from legal condition. A person may be baptized and remain enslaved. A soul may be admitted while a body is still owned. It is a remarkably efficient bit of moral compartmentalizing. The church door opens, the chains remain. There is almost a grim elegance to the hypocrisy. You take a place near the back and watch the room fill. Planters arrive with the composed confidence of men accustomed to deference. Wives settle children with low instructions and firm hands. Poorer whites take places according to local habit and visible rank. Black worshippers, free or enslaved depending on circumstance, inhabit the room under that same ordering gaze. The sermon has not begun, yet the seating itself already explains a great deal about colonial religion. Everyone may be present before God, but no one is allowed to forget the earthly ladder for very long. The minister rises. His gown smells faintly of dust and stale fabric. His voice is practiced, steady, warm in places, stern in others. He speaks of obedience, humility, divine providence, and the duties of households. No single sentence sounds monstrous. That is the difficulty. Moral compromise rarely enters waving a black flag. It speaks in reasonable tones and selects certain verses with great confidence. You listen as scriptural language is shaped into social reassurance. Servants must be dutiful. Masters must be just. Families must be orderly. The colony nods along, relieved to hear faith arranged into something so manageable. Yet under the smooth surface, anxiety remains. Some colonists worry that baptism might complicate ownership. They know English traditions have sometimes linked Christian belonging with certain protections. They know missionaries and clergy can be troublesome when they take theology too seriously. They know an enslaved person who learns doctrine might also learn to speak in moral terms that embarrass the master. Best, then, to close the loophole before conscience gets any ideas. A quirky detail from parish life makes the whole scene even stranger. Church attendance in colonial Virginia could be legally required, and people might be fined for missing services. Imagine that. A government anxious about disorder compelling attendance at worship while also building hereditary slavery. The colony insists people show up for moral instruction, then carefully trims that instruction until it does not interrupt profit. Human beings have always had a talent for compulsory holiness. After the service, the yard becomes a place of conversation and evaluation. Men discuss crop prospects, county business, weather, debts, and marriages. Women exchange news in quieter tones. Children chase one another until stopped. The grass is damp underfoot. A horse shifts and jingles its tack. The smell of trampled earth mixes with perfume from crushed mint near the church path. Religion here is never entirely separate from administration. Parish life overlaps with local authority, social visibility and community judgment. Being seen matters, so does being seen to believe correctly. You drift near a small cluster of men speaking after worship. One planter says he sees no problem with teaching enslaved people the catechism so long as it improves obedience. Another sounds hesitant about full instruction, perhaps fearing it encourages ambition, literacy, or arguments. A third shrugs and says the law will settle such concerns, which is the colonial version of saying, let us not trouble ourselves with too much humanity. It is remarkable how often practical men turn out to be practical only in one direction. For black people in Virginia, religion can still offer something real even within these limits. Prayer, song, scripture, and ritual may provide comfort, language for suffering, and a sense of dignity not granted by the wider society. A baptized person might claim, at least inwardly, a relation to God that no planter can fully mediate. That matters. The inner life is not trivial. Faith can sustain breath, memory, patience, and self-respect in conditions designed to strip all four away. You see this in smaller moments more than grand ones. A woman murmuring a prayer while lifting water. A man pausing before sleep with eyes closed and hands still. A whispered blessing over a child. A remembered phrase from scripture repeated under the breath during labour. These gestures do not overthrow the system. They keep a person whole enough to endure it. Still, the law keeps leaning the other way. Once Virginia clarifies that baptism does not free the enslaved, one possible road narrows sharply. A Christian master may continue as master. An enslaved convert remains legally unfree. The colony can now enjoy the moral prestige of evangelizing without accepting the social cost of emancipation. It is a neat arrangement for those in charge, one that allows them to imagine themselves charitable while changing nothing essential. Historians still debate how sincerely individual ministers or planters pursued Christian instruction for enslaved Africans in this early period, and how widely religious practice among the enslaved took organized or informal forms. The evidence is uneven. Some clergy urged baptism more actively than others. Some masters resisted it, fearing complications. Some enslaved people embraced Christian practice in ways shaped by African memory, local circumstance, and the limits imposed on them. The uncertainty is real. So is the broader pattern. Religion did not break slavery's hold in Virginia. The ruling order made sure of that. You leave the churchyard and walk toward a nearby dwelling where a child is being prepared for baptism. The room is close and warm. Steam rises from a kettle. Linen dries on a line near the hearth. The scent is milk, smoke, damp wool, and the clean mineral smell of water in a basin. A woman smooths the child's clothing with careful fingers. Another adjusts a cap. The baby squirms, red-faced and indignant, unimpressed by theology. For free families, the ritual may carry hope, belonging, and social recognition. For enslaved families, similar rites can carry tenderness as well, but without the promise that spiritual inclusion will alter earthly vulnerability. That contrast hurts. A child may receive holy water and still remain property in the eyes of the colony. A mother may hear sacred words spoken over her infant and still know the law claims that infant's future. The church marks the soul. The courts mark the condition. Between those two acts, Virginia chooses the court. You continue on to a county seat where questions of faith and status occasionally brush against one another more bluntly. Papers are sorted. Names are read aloud. A clerk scratches notes while a magistrate listens with tired impatience. The room smells of ink, sweat, and the faint mustiness of leather bindings. Here, when disputes arise about servants, punishment, household order, or property, legal reasoning usually outruns moral scruple. Even men who might speak movingly of salvation on one day become very crisp about ownership on the next. That split teaches the whole society something poisonous. It teaches that a person may be spiritually recognized and legally denied. It teaches that moral language can coexist with exploitation, so long as categories are carefully maintained. It teaches that compassion is acceptable as sentiment, but dangerous as policy. Once learned, these lessons travel fast, and yet not all faith in the colony is hollow. Some believers are troubled. Some clergy likely sense the contradiction even when they do not confront it fully. Some ordinary people hear the language of Christian fellowship and feel its sting against visible injustice. You can never assume perfect comfort among the powerful, because hypocrisy often requires constant maintenance. A man must keep preaching one thing and practicing another. That takes effort. It may not redeem him, but it does reveal strain. In the late afternoon, you follow a footpath past marsh grass and low trees toward the quarters. The air cools a little. Mosquitoes begin their evening campaign with tiresome enthusiasm. Mud sucks softly at your shoes where the ground stays wet. Nearby, a woman hums while shelling beans into a bowl. The rhythm is steady and quiet. A child nearby repeats a phrase from a prayer, not quite getting the words right. The woman smiles despite her weariness and corrects the child gently. There it is again. Faith passing hand to hand, voice to voice. In forms the colony cannot fully supervise. This matters because domination always wants to define meaning from above. It wants church to support law, law to protect property, and property to command labour. But people living under pressure often take what they are given and turn it slightly, enough to preserve a selfhood. A prayer becomes comfort rather than compliance. A Bible story becomes a language for endurance. A hymn becomes a place to breathe. By evening, the settlement settles into softer sounds. Frogs start their low chorus near the water. A spoon taps the side of a wooden bowl. Firelight flickers across walls darkened by smoke. In one hut, someone speaks of Moses in a near whisper, lingering over the image of bondage and deliverance with a care too pointed to be accidental. No declaration follows. None is needed. Stories can carry meanings larger than the room. You stand outside and breathe in night air touched by ash, river damp, and the sweetness of crushed grass. Above you, the sky clears enough for stars. They appear indifferent, patient, and impossibly far. Beneath them, Virginia keeps building a society where religious belonging is permitted only when it does not disturb ownership. Baptism may wash the forehead. It will not loosen the legal grip. Prayer may soothe the heart. It will not move the magistrate. The colony has arranged things carefully that way, and still, within that arrangement, people believe, hope, sing, murmur, teach, and remember. Faith does not free them in law. It does something quieter, and perhaps just as stubborn. It protects an inward claim the colony cannot fully reach. A woman bows her head over a sleeping child. A man whispers grace over coarse food. A child repeats sacred words by the fire. These acts do not overturn the system. They refuse to let the system define the whole person, so the night deepens around church, court, field, and dwelling alike. The sacred and the legal remain twisted together, each shaping the colony's conscience in opposite directions. One speaks of souls, the other speaks of condition. Virginia listens to both and chooses the version that costs the powerful least. That is the moral decision hidden inside all the pious language. Faith may be welcomed. Freedom is not. You enter the colony's family life where the deepest wound is not only labour, but belonging itself. Virginia has begun deciding who may claim a child, who may pass on a name, who may inherit land, and who may be inherited like livestock or furniture. These decisions do not stay in courtrooms. They settle into kitchens, sleeping spaces, yards, and doorways. They alter the feeling of a mother's touch, the meaning of a father's silence, and the future held inside an infant's first cry. In this world, family is no longer only a matter of love, kinship, and duty. It has been dragged into the marketplace and made to answer to ownership. Dawn arrives under a sky the colour of pewter. The ground is wet from night mist, and the smell of earth rises thick and cool as you walk between dwellings. Somewhere nearby, corn cakes are already cooking on a flat surface, and the scent of meal and smoke folds together in the damp air. A baby coughs once, then settles. A woman murmurs something soft and rhythmic, perhaps a comfort, perhaps a warning not to wake the others. Chickens stir under a cart, a door opens, and a strip of pale light falls across packed dirt. These are family sounds. That is what makes the colony's new logic so terrible. It does not merely control work, it reaches into ordinary human closeness and assigns it a price. A mainstream historical fact anchors the whole scene. Once Virginia made status hereditary through the mother, the colony strengthened a system in which enslaved families could be formed biologically and emotionally, yet never fully protected in law. Parents and children might live together, but the legal order treated that bond as subordinate to ownership. Kinship could exist. Security could not. You see the difference immediately. In a planter's house, family is spoken of with confidence. Children bear names that matter in deeds and wills. A son may inherit land. A daughter may carry property through marriage. A father's acknowledgement is socially valuable, legally recognizable, and publicly affirmed. Household order here is presented as respectable civilization. The silver spoon, the Bible, the table, the bedstead, the family chest. All of it suggests continuity. One generation hands something to the next and expects the law to honour that transfer. A short walk away, in the quarters, continuity feels more fragile. A mother feeds a child from a wooden bowl, steadying the small chin with work-worn fingers. A man returns from labour and lifts a little girl who clings to his neck with sleepy trust. An older woman braids a child's hair by the doorway while evening ash still clings to her skirt from the cook fire. These are family acts as real as any in the planter's house. Yet the colony refuses to shield them in the same way. Love exists, but the law keeps looking past it toward property rights that belong to someone else. You continue through the waking settlement and feel how naming itself is divided by rank. Names in elite households are repeated, recorded, and linked to inheritance. They carry memory forward in a way the law approves. Among the enslaved, names also matter deeply, but the legal world records them differently, often carelessly, sometimes only when accounting for sale, labour, or punishment. A child may be cherished within a family circle and still appear in the wider record as a possession on a list. That reduction is one of the colony's most chilling habits. It knows how to count people without recognising them. The atmosphere of the quarters holds all the senses at once. Smoke from morning fires stings the eyes. Damp cloth brushes cold against the wrist when someone reaches past a line of drying garments. The ground is uneven under bare feet, soft in one spot and hard-packed in another. Someone is grinding meal, and the steady scrape sounds almost like breathing. The smell is ash, sweat, wet wood, and porridge thickening over heat. Nothing here is luxurious. Everything here is lived. The new legal logic changes the emotional weather of parenting. A black mother can love fiercely and still know that love offers no legal claim strong enough to defeat ownership. A father may care, teach, guide, protect, and provide what comfort he can, while also knowing the law does not arrange the child's future around his rights. The colony has not erased parenthood. It has made it vulnerable in a special, targeted way. This vulnerability touches mixed ancestry children with particular force. White fathers may know very well that a child is theirs by blood, but the law's emphasis on maternal status lets them slip sideways out of obligation. The child follows the mother, the father keeps his land, reputation, and silence. It is a brutally efficient arrangement. The system absorbs intimacy, coercion, and reproduction while minimizing responsibility for powerful men. Paternity becomes socially noticeable only when convenient. Maternity becomes legally decisive when profitable. A quirky detail from family life in the 17th century deepens the contrast. People often kept precious objects, tiny things really, a spoon, a kerchief, a worn Bible, a string of beads, a carved token, as anchors of memory inside households that had little spare comfort. These items mattered because family history often lived in touch as much as in writing. Imagine how sharp that meaning became for enslaved people, whose legal claims to one another were so weak. A small object could become proof of tenderness in a world that denied formal proof of belonging. You stop near a doorway where an older woman is teaching a child how to tie a strip of cloth. The lesson is practical, but her tone carries patience and authority. Nearby, another child watches with solemn concentration, thumb tucked into the mouth. This is how family knowledge survives, through repetition, through hands guiding smaller hands, through sayings, recipes, habits, warnings, lullabies, and jokes. The law cannot easily record such transmissions. That is precisely why they matter. Still, the colony intrudes. A child growing strong is noticed not only as a blessing, but as future labour. A young girl is valued not only as a daughter, but as someone whose own future children may enlarge an owner's estate. A boy is seen not only as lively or curious, but as another body that can be put to work. Once status is hereditary, childhood itself becomes entangled with economic projection. The innocence people like to imagine around children is thinned by calculation. By midday, heat presses down so hard the air seems to stop moving. In the shade beside a rough wall, a mother adjusts a sleeping infant against her chest. The child's hair is damp with sweat. The woman rocks lightly, more from habit than from any available leisure. Across the yard, a planter's wife supervises household tasks with the practiced tone of someone convinced this supervision counts as hardship. She's concerned with order, linen, storage, and proper conduct. Those concerns are real within her world. Yet the contrast remains sharp. Her household discipline is built upon the insecurity of other families. You begin to notice how inheritance works as an emotional language among the powerful. Fathers speak of what will be left to sons. Mothers preserve cloth, tableware, recipes, and devotional objects for daughters. Family identity accumulates through possessions safely passed down. The law supports this continuity and even celebrates it. Meanwhile, enslaved families live inside a condition where the most precious thing, the relation itself, may be interrupted by sale, debt, death, punishment, or relocation. Their inheritance becomes less material and more fragile stories. Gestures, names spoken at night, songs remembered, techniques of care, scraps of language, ways of braiding hair, ways of mourning. These are durable in spirit and delicate in circumstance. Scholars still debate how often early Virginia households separated enslaved family members in this exact period compared with later, more fully developed plantation systems. The records are not always clear enough to measure the scale precisely, but the legal principle was already in place. Once people are property and children inherit status through the mother, family bonds exist at the mercy of ownership, even where separation had not yet occurred. Insecurity itself became part of daily life. You walk toward a kitchen garden where beans twist around poles and squash leaves spread broad over the soil. The smell of tomato would not greet you here yet, but herbs do, sharp and clean when crushed between the fingers. A woman plucks greens while speaking softly to a child beside her. The child repeats the names of the plants with grave determination, turning language into a game. There is something beautiful in that. Knowledge offered as intimacy, food gathering as teaching, family as education in its quietest form. At the same time, the colony keeps trying to redraw that intimacy in legal terms. A child belongs where ownership says the child belongs. A mother's body produces a legal condition. A father's recognition can vanish behind convenience. Household authority among the powerful becomes more secure because the households of the enslaved remain insecure. One kind of family is strengthened by the weakening of another. In the late afternoon, shadows stretch long across the yard. The heat loosens a little. A little boy chases another child with a feather, shrieking with laughter. An older girl rolls her eyes at the game but smiles anyway. Nearby, an elderly man carves patiently at a small piece of wood with a blade worn thin from use. Tiny curls fall into his lap. Perhaps it will become a toy, perhaps a handle, perhaps a keepsake. The act itself feels like defiance. To make something by hand for someone you love is to insist that relationship matters more than the inventory. And yet inventories remain. The colony is very fond of them. It can list ages, capacities, conditions, and values with unnerving composure. It can appraise a human household as if measuring barrels and cattle. What it cannot measure is what passes between people when a child reaches automatically for a familiar hand in the dark. That gesture belongs to another order of truth. As evening comes, cooking smoke turns blue in the fading light. The smell of stewed greens, ash, and cornmeal drifts low across the settlement. Someone hums while stirring a pot. Someone else mends a torn sleeve by the door, eyes narrowed in concentration as daylight weakens. A child falls asleep sitting up and is gently laid down on folded cloth. You hear a father tell a story with a playful seriousness that makes the younger listeners lean close. The words are half lesson, half comfort. Their exact shape may vanish by morning. Their effect will not. This is how families under threat preserve themselves. Not through legal guarantee, but through repeated acts of care. A meal shared, a warning given, a song remembered, hair braided, a sore foot washed, a baby named, a joke told at the right moment. The colony underestimates these actions because it confuses power with value. It thinks what is enforceable is what is real. Family life proves otherwise every day, yet the system's pressure does not lift. Behind every tender scene stands the knowledge that these ties are not sovereign. That knowledge changes posture, speech, and sleep. It lives in the tightened arm around a child. It lives in the quick glance when footsteps approach. It lives in the habit of treasuring moments because moments may be all the law allows one to own. Night gathers fully now. Firelight flickers on faces and walls. Crickets begin their patient chorus. The air smells softer, cooler, touched by river damp and the last of the cook fires. In one hut, a child is rocked. In another, a couple speak in low tones after the younger ones sleep. In another, an older woman folds a cloth around a tiny object and tucks it away carefully for safekeeping. The whole settlement breathes in layers of kinship, fear, fatigue, and stubborn attachment. Virginia's new logic has tried to recast family as transferable property for black people, while strengthening inheritance for white households. That is its design. But design is not total victory. People still recognize one another as mother, father, daughter, son, auntie, elder, beloved. They keep making family in the only ways left to them, through care that survives without legal shelter. The law may refuse to honour those bonds. It cannot stop them from being real. And so, in the warm dark of the colony, you understand the full cruelty of hereditary slavery. It does not only seize labour, it reaches into the nest of human belonging and claims the right to sort, weaken, and sell what should never have been property at all. You begin to notice resistance not in grand declarations, but in the small places where control slips. Virginia likes to imagine itself orderly. Laws are written, instructions are given, labour is counted, punishments are threatened. Yet human beings are gloriously difficult to flatten, and the colony keeps discovering that domination requires constant maintenance. Even then, it never fully succeeds. Resistance lives in the pause before obedience, in the hidden choice, in the muttered warning, in the body that slows at the right moment, in the memory that refuses to die just because a planter finds it inconvenient. The day starts before sunrise with a soft confusion of waking sounds. A baby fusses. Someone clears a throat in the dark. Ashes stirred back to life at a hearth, and the first thread of smoke rises into the cool air. It smells of damp wood and last night's cinders. Outside, the ground is slick with dew. Your shoes pick up mud at once, because Virginia never misses a chance to remind you that everything here comes with moisture, effort, and a little annoyance. From the fields comes only silence for now, but it is the kind of silence that already contains labour waiting to happen. You move among the quarters and work yards and realise that refusal does not always look dramatic. It often looks ordinary. A woman keeps one handful of seed aside from what is expected. A man takes an extra moment at the well to pass information in a low voice. A child learns two versions of the world, the one spoken openly and the one spoken carefully among trusted people. A worker appears duller than he is. Another appears more compliant than she feels. The colony thinks it understands these people because it measures output. It rarely understands the inner calculations taking place beneath lowered eyes. A mainstream historical fact belongs here. Enslaved Africans and their descendants in colonial America resisted slavery in many forms, including running away, work slowdowns, concealment, negotiation, sabotage, preserving cultural practices, and building support networks. Open revolt is only one kind of resistance. Daily survival with intention can be another. That truth matters because Virginia's system depends on the fantasy of complete control. Owners want bodies to work, women to bear children, households to submit, and the law to settle every doubt in favour of mastery. But law can command only so much. It can threaten. It can punish. It cannot force genuine loyalty. It cannot erase grief. It cannot make a person stop thinking. So resistance takes the shapes left available by pressure. You follow a work gang toward the tobacco fields. The early sun is still gentle, but the heat will sharpen quickly. The leaves are heavy with moisture, and when workers brush against them, the damp clings to fabric and skin. Insects whine around the edges of the rows. A hoe cuts into the soil with a regular, blunt sound. At first, everything appears efficient. Then you start to see the tiny choices. Someone works a little less quickly when the overseer turns away. Someone misunderstands an order that was perfectly clear a moment earlier. Someone lets a tool need mending sooner than expected. None of this stops the system. All of it forces the system to expend more energy. That is one of the colony's little secrets. Domination is exhausting for the dominator too. It must watch, inspect, count, threaten, repeat, and suspect. It can never fully relax. because the people it claims as property remain people. You step aside near the edge of the field and smell crushed tobacco, warm soil, and salt from drying sweat. A dragonfly flashes blue above a ditch. For a brief second, the scene is almost peaceful, until an overseer barks an instruction and the illusion collapses. The workers bend again. One woman says nothing, but the look she gives another carries meaning. Shared knowledge moves quickly in such spaces. Who is safe to trust? Who has heard news from a landing? Who may try to slip away? Who needs covering for a missed task? Resistance is often social before it is visible. Runaways haunt the colony's imagination. Even a short escape unsettles owners because it proves that a bound person still claims movement, direction, and choice. Some run for a few hours, some for days, some with a plan, some simply because staying put feels impossible. The landscape is difficult, full of rivers, swamps, woods, insects, hunger, and patrols. That danger makes the attempt more striking, not less. To leave under such conditions is to declare that uncertainty is preferable to certain domination. A quirky detail from 17th century escape attempts gives this struggle a very human texture. Runaways often took practical items rather than dramatic ones. Extra shoes, food, tools, bits of clothing, perhaps a small knife for ordinary use. Not the grand gear of adventure stories, just the plain equipment needed to outlast mud, cold, and hunger. It is almost endearing in its realism. Freedom, in practice, often begins with sore feet and bad weather. Not every act of resistance involves movement across distance. Some involve movement across meaning. You hear it in names. A person may answer to the name used by owners and still keep another name, or a deeper sense of self, alive among trusted companions. You hear it in songs whose rhythms carry memory beyond English words. You see it in cooking methods adapted from African knowledge, in gardening choices, in grooming practices, in stories told at night when the day's demands finally loosen. Culture itself becomes a form of refusal when the system is trying to reduce life to labour. You pass a yard where an older woman is braiding a younger girl's hair with steady fingers. The smell of wood smoke drifts around them. A pot simmers nearby, giving off the earthy scent of beans and greens. The girl sits still for a while, then fidgets, then is gently corrected. Nothing here looks rebellious to an outsider, yet the act carries identity, discipline, care, and continuity. It says, you belong to a people, not just to a ledger. That kind of quiet continuity is exactly what power dislikes, because it creates loyalties outside ownership. By midday, the heat has turned heavy and mean. Shirts cling, flies gather. The air near the curing sheds tastes almost bitter. A man lifting bundles pauses longer than he should, hand braced on his knee. Is he exhausted? Certainly. Is he also taking the only pause he can claim? Very possibly. The line between survival and resistance is often thin. Historians sometimes separate the two for neat analysis, but in lived experience they overlap. To preserve strength, preserve kin, preserve memory, preserve a scrap of choice. All of that undermines a system designed to consume the whole person. You continue toward a less visible corner of the plantation landscape, the spaces behind fences, near kitchens, along wood lines, at the edge of marsh and brush. These are places where messages travel. A warning about an overseer's temper, a hint that a boat leaves before dawn, news of a court ruling, the location of hidden food. Colonies like Virginia depend on information flowing downward through orders. Enslaved communities develop their own sideways routes. Sideways information can save a beating, delay a punishment, or make escape imaginable. Scholars still argue over how much organised collective resistance existed in early Virginia compared with later centuries. When the enslaved population was larger and more entrenched, the records preserve some incidents and miss many more. What is clear is that resistance didn't wait for large-scale rebellion to exist. It lived in scattered acts, shared strategies, concealed intentions, and the refusal to let the master's perspective become the only truth. A man near the storehouse drops a bundle badly enough to split the wrapping. The overseer curses. Repairs are needed. Time is lost. Was it an accident? Perhaps. Was it careless? Possibly. Was it deliberate? The beauty of such moments, from the worker's point of view, is that power can rarely know for certain. Ambiguity becomes shelter. The colony wants clarity. The oppressed learn the uses of uncertainty. There is also negotiation, which sounds far too polite for the circumstances, but the practice is real. Enslaved people press for small concessions, better rations, permission to visit a spouse, lighter assignments during illness, time with a child, access to a garden patch, reduced punishment, acknowledgement of a complaint. Each request must move through unequal power, and many fail. Yet the very act of pressing a claim insists on personhood. It says, I assess, I ask, I judge what is fair, I have interests of my own. Even when the answer is no, the human will behind the request remains. You walk toward the river in the later afternoon. Reeds sway softly at the bank. Mud sucks at the edge where water has recently fallen. The smell is brackish, green, and faintly rotten in the way marshes often are. Oars dip somewhere beyond a bend. Rivers can trap, but they can also connect. A landing brings goods, gossip, strangers, opportunity, danger. People hear things there. A sailor notices faces. A labourer catches a rumour. Someone mentions conditions in another county. Someone else speaks of a free black person upriver. Even rumour can nourish resistance, because it proves the plantation is not the entire world. Family loyalty also becomes resistance under these conditions. A mother teaching a child caution is resisting. A father warning a son which paths to avoid is resisting. People sharing food so that a weak elder can endure another week are resisting. A couple maintaining a bond across forced distance are resisting. The colony would prefer isolated units of labour. Kinship makes people answer to one another instead. You hear a low conversation near dusk between two women cleaning pots with sand and water. Their voices are almost lost beneath the scrape of their hands against the metal. They trade more than chores. One passes on a warning about a particular man. The other mentions a safe person to approach in another yard. The exchange is practical, unemotional on the surface, and incredibly important. Resistance often sounds like housekeeping, because that is where it has learned to hide. As evening settles, music begins in fragments. Hands tap on wood. Someone hums, another answers. The rhythm builds, then falls back, careful not to draw the wrong attention. Sound can gather people, steady breathing, restore memory. It can also encode belonging. A tune carried from one generation to the next becomes proof that the colony has not fully taken hold of the mind. That is no small thing. Systems of slavery aim not only to force work, but to define reality. Music quietly objects. You stand in the warm dark as firelight flickers against hut walls, and the smell of supper hangs low in the air. Cornmeal, smoke, greens, sweat, damp cloth. A child laughs once before being hushed. Somewhere farther off, a dog barks toward the woods. People are tired to the bone, yet tired people still strategize. They still hide a scrap of food. They still choose whom to trust. They still mark which moonlit nights are best for movement. They still remember paths through trees, names of creeks, habits of guards. Even despair can contain planning. This does not make resistance romantic. Many attempts fail. Many quiet acts go punished or unnoticed. The risk is constant, a misjudged ally, a loud floorboard, a missing tool, a suspicious overseer. Any of these can turn intention into suffering. That is why the persistence matters so much. People resist not because success is guaranteed, but because submission alone cannot answer the demands of self-respect, love, and survival. By full night, the colony appears calm again. From a distance it is almost serene. Stars above, river below, a few lights in the darkness, the fields resting after labour, but up close, beneath that appearance, the whole place is threaded with hidden decisions. Someone will leave before dawn, someone will cover for an absent body, someone will pass a message by the well, someone will keep a forbidden memory alive in a child's ear, someone will work tomorrow, but not with the heart the master imagines he owns. And there, in those countless quiet acts, Virginia's fantasy of total mastery begins to fray. The law may define condition, the planter may claim title, the overseer may control the day's motions. Yet under all of it, black men, women, and children continue making choices that preserve dignity, kinship, culture, and possibility. Their resistance is not always loud enough for the records to hear. It is still there, breathing in the dark, waiting for the next small opening. You step back now and feel the colony from a greater height, not as a single plantation or one law court or one weary household, but as a whole social world rearranging itself around a brutal idea. The air over Virginia carries the same familiar scents: river mud, wood smoke, damp grass, and tobacco curing in dark sheds. Yet something larger has settled into that air. A principle has been chosen. A child's status will follow the mother. It sounds narrow when spoken aloud. It is anything but narrow. It reaches outward into labour, inheritance, sexuality, religion, race, and time. It tells the colony how to reproduce slavery without having to explain itself each morning anew. Dawn spreads slowly over the tidewater. Light catches on creek water and on the roofs of houses still wet from night mist. A cow shifts in its pen. A gull cries over the river. Somewhere, someone knocks ash from a hearth and begins the first fire of the day. The smell rises clean at first, then thickens as breakfast is prepared. The scene feels ordinary enough to soothe you for a moment. Then the deeper truth returns. Ordinary life is exactly where the great change has rooted itself, not in spectacle, in routine. A mainstream historical fact belongs at the centre of this final view. The 1662 Virginia law helped make slavery hereditary through the maternal line, and that principle became foundational in the development of racial slavery in English North America. By linking bondage to birth, the colony strengthened a self-reproducing system that could expand across generations without relying only on new arrivals from across the Atlantic. That self-reproducing quality is the key. It changes slavery from a harsh condition applied to individuals into a structure that renews itself through family lines. A woman can be exploited for labour in the present and for the legal status of her future children. A child can be assigned a place in the hierarchy before speaking a word. A white father can disappear from legal consequence while remaining present in social power. Planters can imagine their labour force not only purchased, but born. The colony has solved an economic problem by deepening a moral catastrophe. You walk along a ridge where the land opens enough to show fields, outbuildings, lanes, and a distant bend in the river. From here, the colony looks almost composed. Rows of crops, smoke rising in narrow streams, boats moving with measured purpose. Yet the composure is deceptive. This landscape has been organised around unequal futures. Some children will inherit land, tools, books, names, and claims the law respects. Others will inherit bondage itself. That difference is the long shadow of 1662. The shadow stretches farther than Virginia. Other colonies will observe, adapt, and refine similar principles. Legal systems in English America will continue building race into bondage and bondage into law, statute by statute, custom by custom, ruling by ruling. The 1662 decision does not do all the work alone, but it helps establish a pattern that later generations deepen. Once a society accepts that slavery can descend automatically through birth, The institution gains chilling durability. Time begins to serve power rather than weaken it. A quirky detail from the world of legal memory adds an odd little twist. Colonial statutes that changed thousands of lives were often preserved in records that look dry, cramped, and almost unimpressive on the page. No grand illumination, no tragic border decoration, just ordinary handwriting or print, as if the future could be rearranged by paperwork no more visually dramatic than a merchant's account. History has a cruel sense of design. Some of its loudest consequences come dressed in the quietest documents. You move down toward a plantation lane where wagon ruts hold yesterday's rain. Mud gives softly under your steps. A child runs past carrying a stick as if it were a horse, wholly absorbed in private play. Nearby, an older woman sorts greens into a basket with practiced hands. A man repairs a hinge with slow concentration. These scenes are small and full of life. That is what makes the law's legacy so awful. It attaches itself to ordinary human acts and bends their meaning. A child at play may already be counted as future labour. A mother's care may exist under the knowledge that the law has proclaimed her child's condition. A household task may support a system built on inherited captivity. The long shadow is also psychological. Once a society writes hereditary slavery into law, people begin imagining difference as natural rather than constructed. White colonists can tell themselves that status at birth is simply how the world is arranged. The legal choice hardens into common sense. That may be the most dangerous transformation of all. What began as a profitable decision starts posing as reality itself. You hear this in the way people talk. They speak not only of ownership, but of categories, of who belongs where, of which bodies are expected to labour, obey, inherit, rule, or serve. Language follows law and then runs ahead of it. Children grow up inside these assumptions. They learn to see racial hierarchy as part of the landscape, like marsh grass or summer heat. A principle once argued in a room becomes a habit of mind spread across generations. Scholars still dispute how singular the 1662 statute should appear within the larger making of slavery. Some emphasize its central importance because it made hereditary bondage explicit in a powerful and influential colony. Others stress that slavery's growth also depended on trade networks, plantation expansion, court decisions, demographic change, and many additional laws. Both views matter. The statute was not the whole machine. It was one of its most important gears. Remove it and the system would still be cruel. With it in place, the cruelty becomes far more stable. You continue toward the river landing, where barrels are being rolled toward shipment, rope strains, wood thuds. Men call short instructions over the scrape of cargo and the slap of water against the dock. Tobacco moves outward toward markets. Profit moves back toward planters, merchants, and officials. The Atlantic world pulses through this quiet shore. Slavery in Virginia is not merely local prejudice written large. It is tied to trade, empire, appetite, and the endless colonial desire to turn land and people into return on investment. The 1662 rule fits neatly into that world, because it makes the supply of labour more predictable from within. Predictable? There is another cold word. The powerful love predictability. It calms lenders, reassures landowners, and steadies inheritance plans. But predictability for them means predestination for others. Once birth fixes bondage, a black child's future becomes legible to the colony in advance. The law does not need to know personality, intelligence, humour, or tenderness. It needs only the status of the mother. Human complexity collapses into legal shorthand. You pause at the edge of the water. The river smells green and brown, alive with mud, fish, and tide. Reeds whisper against one another in the breeze. Beyond them, the water catches sunlight in broken flashes. It would be easy to slip into the beauty of the scene and let the mind rest. But the beauty here has always had human cost folded inside it. The boats, the barrels, the broad estates, the sense of a colony finding its footing. All of it has been built by decisions that sort people into property and kin into inventory. The law's shadow also falls across womanhood itself. White womanhood in the colony becomes more protected as a site of legitimate inheritance and family respectability. Black womanhood is marked differently, treated as labouring, surveilled, and legally tied to the reproduction of status. This division helps build race and gender together into the colony's social order. Women are not simply women in Virginia's legal imagination. Their bodies are read through property, ancestry, and power. Children bear that reading from birth. One infant is swaddled into a future of family name and legal recognition. Another is swaddled into a future the colony has already narrowed. Both cry with the same urgency. Both need warmth and milk. Both reach with tiny hands. The law, however, does not meet them as equals. It separates them before they can know the meaning of separation. By late afternoon, the heat softens. Shadows lengthen from fences and sheds. The smell of supper begins to stir from kitchens and yard fires. Somewhere, a fiddle note is tested, thin and uncertain. Somewhere else, a woman hums while sweeping a doorway. These sounds belong to life's persistence, and that persistence becomes one of the most important parts of the long shadow too. The colony creates structures of inherited domination, but people continue to create kinship, memory, humour, faith, and skill inside those structures. The system is powerful. It is never total. That matters when you think about legacy. The 1662 law helped shape centuries of bondage, but it also shaped centuries of resistance, survival, and black family endurance. A system designed to reproduce slavery also produced generations who learned how to preserve personhood under siege. That does not redeem the law. Nothing could. It does, however, remind you that history is not only the story of what power intended, it is also the story of what people protected from power. The evening air cools enough to feel kind on your skin. Smoke rises blue above the settlement. Crickets begin their slow work in the grass. A mother lifts a child from the dirt and brushes the knees clean. A father mends a strap in fading light. An elder speaks quiet to two younger listeners who lean close to catch every word. Around them, the colony's legal order remains harsh, but life continues making meanings the law did not author. That is part of the shadow too. It is dark, but not empty. If you step even farther back beyond Virginia, beyond the 17th century, you can see how one colonial choice helped shape a future nation. Hereditary racial slavery would expand, harden, enrich some, devastate many, and leave marks that outlasted the institution itself. Wealth, landholding, family security, and political power in America would grow unevenly from foundations laid in part by rules like this one. The consequences would reach far beyond plantation fields, into courts, churches, schools, memory, and identity, and yet the moment of decision remains strangely quiet in its original setting. A room, a few men, a law, no thunder, no shattered sky, only ink drying while outside the colony smells of tobacco and river mist. That is what stays with you most. History does not always announce its ugliest transformations with noise. Sometimes it speaks softly enough that the people benefiting from it can keep eating supper as though nothing much has happened. Night comes fully now. The fields disappear into dark shapes. Water turns black except where moonlight touches it. Firelight glows from doorways and leaks through cracks in rough walls. Voices drop lower. Babies are rocked. Bowls are scraped clean. A tired horse shifts in the stable. The whole colony seems to exhale. But the law does not sleep. It remains in the categories people now trust, in the futures assigned at birth, in the inherited claims that tomorrow will continue to enforce. You stand there a little longer, listening to frogs by the marsh and the faint rustle of leaves in the night breeze, and understand the long shadow for what it is. Not only oppression in 1 year, but a design for many years. Not only a rule about mothers and children, but a way of making slavery durable, intimate, and self-renewing. A law that changed not merely labour, but lineage, not merely property, but personhood, not merely Virginia, but the course of American history. Now the night deepens and the sounds soften even more. The river keeps its slow, patient motion under the stars. The smoke from the last cook fires thins into the dark until it can no longer be seen. The fields rest at last, though their quiet still holds the memory of bent backs, tired hands, and long days beneath a punishing sun. You let the landscape grow gentler around you. The damp air cools your skin. The reeds sway with a sleepy whisper. Somewhere nearby, a mother settles a child against her shoulder, and the rhythm of that small motion seems older than any law. You breathe in the scent of ash, grass, and water. It is softer now, less like work, more like distance. The houses become only shapes. The lanes fade. The sharp edges of the colony blur into moonlight and hush. What remains is the sense of human lives carried through hard centuries by memory, care, endurance, and the quiet refusal to let any statute define the whole of a person. Even in a world designed to inherit cruelty, people still pass down songs, names, skills, prayers, and tenderness. They carried what they could through the dark, so you let the story settle, let the paper rest, let the voices grow faint, let the river take the last of the noise with it. The law remains part of history, heavy and undeniable, but it does not get the final feeling tonight. The final feeling is quieter than power and older than fear. It is the warmth of a hand guiding a child, the calm of a low song in firelight, the steady breath of people who endured and kept something human alive under the wide Virginia sky. With the marsh murmuring and the stars overhead, the colony finally drifts into silence.